8 infant monkeys were taken from their mothers at birth. 4 males, 4 females. They were given 2 surrogate mothers in their cages. One was wire and gave milk. One was cloth and gave nothing. Every single monkey chose the cloth one. They clung to her when they were frightened. They slept against her at night. And some of them grew up so broken that none of them could put them back together. This is the work of Harry Harlow, the most influential and most disturbing primate research of the 20th century. The story most people know stops at the cloth mother. The real one is much darker. In 1958, an American psychologist named Harry Harlow set out to disprove what every textbook in his field was telling new parents. He had run primate research at the University of Wisconsin for more than 20 years by the time he reached this experiment. He had spent that entire career watching the dominant theory of child development insist that affection was sentimental noise. Babies bonded to their mothers. The theory went because mothers fed them. Touch was incidental. Cuddling was indulgent. Love in any clinical sense was nothing more than a conditioned response to a milk bottle. Pediatricians warned parents against picking up crying infants too often. Orphanages were designed to minimise physical contact with the children inside them. An entire field of psychology has been built on the idea that a baby is essentially a stomach. Harlow did not believe any of it. He had seen something in his own laboratory years before they had stayed with him. Infant monkeys raised in bare cages would form intense, possessive attachments to the cloth diapers used to line the cage floor. They would scream when the diapers were removed for cleaning. They would cling to the soft fabric and refuse to be parted from it. Calories were not what these animals were attached to. Cloth was. He chose rhesus macaques for the formal experiment because they share around 93% of our DNA and because their infants form attachments in the same developmental window human infants do. He built the surrogate setup to settle the question for the field once and for all. The result was not subtle. The infants spent the vast majority of their waking hours on the cloth mother. They visited the wire one only long enough to feed, then sprinted back. When Harlow placed a mechanical spider or a wind-up drumming bear into the cage, they ran to the cloth mother and pressed their entire bodies against her. When she was absent, they froze in the corner and screamed. The wire mother had given them food. They wanted nothing to do with her. Harlow would write afterward that man cannot live by milk alone. The 1958 paper changed how an entire generation of doctors talked about raising children. Hospitals updated their nursery protocols. Orphanages around the world were redesigned. The cloth mother became one of the most cited images in 20th century psychology. But Harlow was not finished. He had answered the question of what comfort gave a young primate. He wanted to know what its absence did, so he kept building. He constructed something he eventually called the vertical chamber apparatus. The name stuck in the published literature. Among the staff and graduate students who worked the lab, it had another name. They called it the pit of despair. It was a stainless steel chamber with slop sides, narrowing towards the bottom, with no exit, no daylight, and nothing to climb. He placed young monkeys inside it, some for days, some for 30 days. The longest stretches ran for a full year. They came out wrong. The monkeys who had spent 30 days inside the chamber were so withdrawn they could not be coaxed to move. They sat in the corners of their new cages with their arms wrapped around their own bodies and rocked back and forth for hours. They flinched at the sight of other monkeys. They bit their own arms and legs until they drew blood. Some refused food. A few starved themselves to death within weeks of release. Harlow wrote in his notes that the chamber had produced animals so damaged that they no longer resembled the species he had taken them from. He had set out to model human depression. He believed that if it could produce the condition in a primate, he could find a way to reverse it. The chamber was the model. What came next was the test. Harlow took the most damaged of his isolates and tried to do something nobody in his field had attempted at that scale. He tried to rehabilitate them. He had a hypothesis. He believed that if the broken monkeys were placed with younger, undamaged ones, the social contact might pull them back into the species. He called the younger ones therapist monkeys. He used 3-month-old females, too young to be intimidated by the strange behaviour of an isolate and gentle enough to not escalate. He matched each broken animal with one. He gave them weeks together, then months. It seemed to work. The damaged monkeys began moving again. They began grooming. They began approaching the younger ones instead of hiding from them. By the standard checklist his lab used to score social behaviour, they were recovering. The 1972 paper Stephen Samoy and Harlow published reported the results as a breakthrough. Some of the rehabilitated monkeys looked, by the end, almost normal. But almost normal was not what they were. When these monkeys were eventually integrated into the larger colony, something began to surface that Harlow had not predicted. The rehabilitated ones did not become healthy members of the group. They became its most dangerous animals. They attacked without provocation. They targeted infants. They escalated fights long past the point any normal raised monkey would have backed down. They could not read the signals of other animals used to call off violence. Submissive postures meant nothing to them. A monkey rolling into its back, exposing its throat, the universal primate gesture for surrender, did not stop them. The females who had been raised in isolation and then rehabilitated enough to mate became what Harlow's lab in 1964 paper called motherless mothers. When they gave birth, they did not nurse. They did not protect. Some of them sat on their own infants and crushed them under their weight. Others bit off fingers or pressed their newborns' faces against the cage floor until they stopped moving. The lab staff began removing the babies at delivery because the mothers could not be trusted with them. These were the monkeys the lab counted as successes. The ones who had failed rehabilitation, who had stayed catatonic, who never re-entered the social order, did not do these things. They were not violent. They had simply withdrawn from the species entirely. The ones who got close enough to functioning to walk among other monkeys were the ones who killed them. Harlow's staff began to understand what they were looking at. The trauma had not been resolved by the rehabilitation. It had been concealed by it. The early damage had built a nervous system that could not regulate aggression, could not read social cues, could not bond. The rehabilitation had taught those monkeys how to move through a colony. It had not taught them how to belong inside one. Harlow would write later that the most disturbing finding was not the violence itself, but how thoroughly it could ride underneath ordinary-looking behaviour right up to the moment it surfaced. The Wire Mother experiment proved that comfort was necessary. The pit of despair proved that its absence destroyed a mind. The rehabilitation studies proved something nobody in the field wanted to publish loudly. Trauma that survives intervention doesn't dissolve, it refines. The popular version of Harlow's legacy stops at the cloth mother. He proved that love mattered. The animal rights movement of the 1970s grew partly out of revulsion at his methods, and his experiments became one of the most cited examples of cruelty in the 20th century science. The textbooks made him a cautionary figure. The discussion ended with the wire and the cloth. But the work that came after that, the chambers and the therapists and the motherless mothers, sat in the literature uncomfortably. The implication was harder to hold. A damaged mind could be taught to perform health. The performance could be convincing. The original wound continued to do its work underneath the performance. And in some cases, the better the rehabilitation looked from outside, the more dangerous the animal became inside it. Harlow himself did not escape the work. His own marriage broke during the height of the isolation experiments. He developed severe depression in the last decade of his career. He was treated with electroconvulsive therapy. He kept working. On December 6, 1981, he died of Parkinson's disease at 76 years old, still defending the experiments, still convinced they had been necessary. And here's the part almost nobody quotes. Harlow's longtime collaborator, Stephen Suomi, was not a doomer. He kept the colony running for decades after Harlow died. He kept changing the variables. He bred monkeys with different temperaments. He found something his predecessor had not been built to look for. Some of the monkeys carried a genetic variant that made them dramatically more vulnerable to early stress. The same variant, in a stable environment with skilled mothering, produced no pathology at all. None. The exact same nervous system that would have hidden the killer became, in a different environment, and an ordinary functioning animal. Suomi wrote that the wound was not the verdict. The environment around the wound was the verdict. The colony could never give its rehabilitated monkeys a real one. Humans could give each other. He called it the difference between repair and design. You cannot repair what has already happened. You can design what happens next.